Hello my fellow Americans, this is H.J. Armstrong, citizen, scholar, saint. Currently, I am developing the bull queer theory, a revolutionary new understanding of history, politics, and society. Today, I would like to talk about one of the most important but least studied bull queer relationships. Most of the well-known bull queers are leading politicians, but of course, there are bull queers at many different levels and in many different occupations. In the future, I will survey the careers of local and regional bull queers. Today, however, I would like to turn to the world of business, where bull queers and their queer cartels have enjoyed immense influence and success in this great country. Andrew Carnegie and Henry Clay Frick were titans of the steel industry. Carnegie, a Scottish immigrant, born in 1835, was the elder of the two men. Frick, born in 1849, began his career producing coke, useful for the steelmaking process. Carnegie, who lived in a time before government tyranny prevented vertical integration, acquired Frick's company and the two men began to work together, with Frick becoming perhaps the greatest manager in the history of industry. Although these two mighty bull queers achieved an immense amount together, their cooperation came unglued due to friction between the two of them. Typically, a successful queer cartel has only one preeminent bull queer whose influence, charisma, and brains win the unquestioning adherence of the rank and file. However, Carnegie was attracted to men of ability and surrounded himself with men who under other circumstances could have been in his place. His pride, almost always justified, led him to underestimate and behave in a rather condescending manner to others. He thought that he was being a good boss and mentor by speaking to Frick as if he were a younger brother or perhaps even a son. However, Frick always intended to take over the cartel for himself, saw their relationship as transactional, and regarded his wing of the cartel as effectively independent. Carnegie and Frick were on good terms once they joined forces in the 1880s. Frick, even if he would never admit it, learned a great deal from working with the more experienced Carnegie. For starters, he learned about the railroad side of the steel industry, something that he had not really understood before. In exchange, he offered up his more youthful and supple body to his Scottish-American partner. It is a long-standing rule of homosexual relationships that the active or pitching partner is dominant and in charge, and yet, Frick does not seem to have understood that. Carnegie, while he was not formally educated, had spent a lot of time improving his mind by reading, and so he knew about the Roman traditions regarding homosexual lovers. Frick, however, was a much purer businessman, and his ambition was fueled by the desire to overtake Carnegie and acquire his many followers and admirers. Frick was determined to emulate but improve upon Carnegie as a bull queer and business tycoon. Carnegie built libraries, so Frick collected art and built galleries. He reasoned that not everyone can read, but almost everyone can appreciate a piece of art. Therefore, as a bull queer and business icon, he would be more relatable and hence, more influential, powerful, and desirable if he associated himself with something with near universal appeal. By this time, Carnegie had built a castle in the town of his birth and often visited Scotland. He had Frick over so that they could role-play as royalty, since the kings of old Europe were the ultimate bull queers. Frick liked the idea of building a castle even if he did not share Carnegie's love of the old world. However, the good times wouldn't last forever. In sports, there is a saying that winning cures all ills, or at least casts them into the shade. Frick's overweening ambition was kept in check so long as the company was growing and his fortune was continuing to increase. That all started to come unraveled in 1892 during the Homestead Strike. At that time in America, there were many communists posing as laborers and getting workers riled up. There had been previous strikes which had turned violent in a number of places. Up to this point, Carnegie had largely avoided trouble with labor by his clever politicking. He argued that the interests of labor and capital were one and the same and made sure that he paid a fair day's wage for a fair day's work. Carnegie almost uniquely allowed his workers to unionize, something that many, including Frick, thought was foolhardy. However, the union had usually cooperated with management and the workers generally trusted Carnegie due to his humble origins and his earlier behavior. As tensions mounted at Homestead, the workers thought that Andrew Carnegie might cut his holiday short and come home to work a miracle. In reality, he fully entrusted Frick to handle the negotiations on his behalf, and he planned to finish his summer at his Scottish castle. Frick had a far more confrontational management style and attitude toward labor, fearing their communistic tendencies, than did Carnegie. Carnegie was fully aware of this, and the two men had discussed the issue at length. Further, the workers were fully aware that Frick was something of a fighter. Despite a slender frame and only being 5 feet, 3 inches tall, Frick did not hesitate to throw down with workers who got out of line. He famously evicted a company tenant by throwing him into a nearby creek and then throwing his mattress after him. Frick warned the workers that they would be fired if they did not accept their new contracts. He also made them aware that he had hired the Pinkerton detectives to protect company policy. Frick also had a pledge from Pennsylvania's governor to deploy the National Guard to clear out the rioters if necessary. Only a fool would not understand that any further violence and disruption would result in legal issues and possibly being on the receiving end of police action. Despite Frick's clarion call for order, the workers insisted upon violence and both sides lost several men. The workers, who were less skilled, lost twice as many men, but overwhelmed the detectives in their barge and forced them to surrender. It was a miracle of God that the workers did not massacre the Pinkertons after they surrendered. The violence shocked everyone, and knowing that they had erred, the mob dispersed and business resumed with a combination of new and returning workers. There were a few trials, but no one was convicted of murder. Frick, restrained by Carnegie, was forced to limit himself to blacklisting the labor activists who had caused problems in the first place. Assessing blame for what went wrong at Homestead became a lifelong obsession for everyone who lived through it. Today, it is beyond obvious that the workers were at fault. This was the story of the Gilded Age, where workers demanded far too much and vastly overrated the value of their skills. Most of them were decent folks who failed to see that they were being taken advantage of by communist agitators. No matter what the bull queers leading America's industries did, the mob would inflict violence on law-abiding citizens and force them to resort to violence. However, Carnegie and Frick were not philosophers in their studies dispassionately discussing the world, but active businessmen who are always on the hunt for lessons learned. Frick was very sensitive about the false allegation that he could or should have done anything differently. It was especially galling to him to hear that the bloodshed would not have occurred if Carnegie had been present. There is no record of Carnegie himself saying this, although Frick believed that this was Carnegie's conviction on the matter, and he made no statement to try to dispel the notion that he would have handled things differently and more adeptly than his protégé. After Homestead, Carnegie began to try to promote other men within his queer cartel and began to slowly whittle away at Frick's role. The untimely death of a major manager, Captain Jones, forced Carnegie to cleave closer to Frick than he would have liked and delayed his demotion by a few years. The biggest change, however, occurred in Frick's heart. Frick felt betrayed by his mentor. He had also come to the conclusion that Carnegie was out of touch and blind to the threat of communism. Frick concluded that he would one day have to save Carnegie from himself. If Carnegie were blind to the existential danger to capitalism and progress posed by labor unions, it would be the death of his company and his queer cartel. Frick knew that he would have to seize power at some point. He did miscalculate a bit, as Carnegie's graying hair and beard did not mean that his wits had dimmed or that his ruthlessness had declined. At one point, Frick tried to buy out Carnegie by posing as an anonymous buyer. Carnegie, however, quickly realized that there were only a handful of potential buyers with an interest in the industry and the capital to invest. Frick's ambition was obvious, and while Carnegie did not necessarily object to younger men succeeding him in theory, in practice he felt that the age gap between them was not quite so sufficient as to justify what would no doubt be a relatively short-lived stint as the King of Steel. To put Frick in his place and let him know that he would never be the preeminent bull queer, Carnegie stopped the proceedings in such a way that enabled him to keep the down payment. Thus, Carnegie pocketed $170,000 of Frick's money for nothing in return. While this sum did not truly harm Frick, it was enough to piss him off. From that point forward, there was not the barest pretense of friendship between them. In fact, it is almost certain that Frick denied Carnegie any further physical favors. This is very unusual, as queer cartels typically involve renewing sexual relationships between bull queers and their subordinates. Frick's quick temper was fueled when he learned that Carnegie jokingly showed visitors his beautiful home in New York and told them that it was all due to a generous gift from Mr. Frick. Carnegie, again, assumed that his superiority to others was obvious, but Frick did not agree. Another rumor began to circulate around this time to the effect that Frick had murdered Andrew's younger brother Tom back in the 1880s to engineer his rise as the manager of Homestead. While drunk, Frick had hinted to Andrew Mellon that while Tom was indeed genuinely ill for the several weeks leading up to his premature death, that pneumonia was not the cause of his demise. Tom was a heavy drinker, and it is likely that Frick spiked his drink with poison. Given Tom Carnegie's weakened condition, this was enough to put him in the ground at the age of only 43, thus clearing a path for Frick to rise up as Andrew Carnegie's right-hand man. Files at the archive suggest that Carnegie believed this to be true, although he could not prove it and never confronted Frick with it. Mellon was afraid of Frick and most likely made Carnegie swear not to disclose that he had snitched. Frick eventually had an outburst at a meeting. Carnegie at that juncture realized that his spurned lover was after his wallet and that the $170,000 lesson had been lost on Frick. After consulting all of the other board members, Carnegie went to Frick to demand that he resign as president and sell his shares. Carnegie's mistake was marching into Frick's office alone and unprotected. Frick assaulted him and Carnegie was forced to scurry away like a scalded dog. Carnegie tried to claim that Frick was violent and a problem, but in the context of a corporate boardroom, where a disproportionately high number of men are bull queers, this made Carnegie seem old and weak. Frick, now reduced to just another board member, continued to snipe at Carnegie and the younger associates for years, but for the most part, the relationship between the two was severed. As is often the case with former lovers, both men continued to reside rent-free in the mind of the other. Carnegie tried to spend his fortune on scholarships, libraries, and beautiful homes. He continued to make the "gift of Mr. Frick" joke, but he was now in his declining years. He was aware that Frick was trying to surpass him, but he was too old to keep up the competition. Frick continued to enhance his fortune and had no intention of losing his hard-earned gains. However, he did create many art galleries. He also built a mansion across from Carnegie's which he said would make the older man's home look like a miner's hovel. By 1919, Carnegie was on his deathbed and he tried to reconcile with Frick. Carnegie feared for his immortal soul and wanted to make things right, so he sent a messenger. Frick read a heartfelt, handwritten note, but he refused to see his former lover a final time. In fact, he told Carnegie that he would eventually see him again, in hell. Carnegie passed away in August. Frick, now 69, but still vigorous, felt that the biggest obstacle to his rise had been removed. It was unusual for someone his age to make a power play, but he was determined to go for it. With Woodrow Wilson's progressive Democratic government failing and flailing, it was looking like an easy victory for Republicans in 1920. Frick knew that he could spread money around to delegates at the convention. Further, the Bolshevik Revolution meant that his experience fighting Reds at Homestead would make him an appealing candidate. Unlike today, political campaigns were short and not particularly taxing. The bout of illness he suffered in fall 1919 was nothing to worry about, or so he thought. Falling ill again while trying to visit his grandchildren, Frick returned home to his palatial mansion only to suffer a heart attack and pass away in December 1919. Had he had another year and a half or so left in the tank, there is little reason to doubt that Frick could have either taken the Republican nomination or gotten the nod as vice president, thus achieving a level of bull queerdom that Carnegie, the immigrant, could never dream of. In the world of business, any study has to conclude with an evaluation of lessons learned. What can we learn about bull queers from studying the relationship between Carnegie and Frick? For starters, we see that bull queers only thrive in environments where they are without constraints. Bull queers are capable of succeeding to a much greater extent than ordinary men, and so it is important to make sure that they are unfettered. The great bull queers of the Gilded Age were able to build America's wealth and turn the United States into a superpower. Carnegie and Frick as bull queers moved the nation forward in spite of resistance from malefactors and short-sighted fools. For America to get back on track, we need to embrace, encourage, and reward our bull queers. The second lesson is that there can only be one preeminent bull queer in a queer cartel. A clear hierarchy is necessary. Carnegie's dominance was accepted by most of his men, but Frick was too much of a maverick for the organization to contain him forever. It was only the great economic growth of the era and the brilliant maneuvers of Carnegie and Frick which created enough excitement to sate Frick's appetite for so long and keep the company together. In an ideal world, Frick would have remained independent and presided over his own queer cartel and business empire. It is a testament to Frick's adaptability that he was able to be such an effective right-hand man for so many years when his most natural role was as the preeminent bull queer. One has to wonder how productive Frick could have been if he had not been held back by Carnegie. Third and final point, bull queers can be very different from one another, even if they are in the same or similar fields of endeavor. Carnegie was temperamentally akin to a king, having a regal presence and a lot of strategic sense. However, he was a bit too focused on the big picture and did not do well in business knife fights. Frick was the more viable bull queer insofar as he was more hands-on and his skill set was better adapted to material reality. Frick could upscale his approach as far as the White House or be a world-class manager at any of today's corporations and climb the ladder straight to the top. By contrast, Carnegie would need opportunities to show off his vision, which would require him to be his own boss by and large. When we seek out leaders in business or in politics, we should look for men with similarities to Carnegie and Frick. However, in a time of crisis, such as the current moment, someone with Frick's versatility would be more useful. In 2024, the closest equivalent to Henry Clay Frick is Donald John Trump. I wholeheartedly recommend that you vote accordingly and let the most talented bull queer of this rather lackluster era lead our country back to greatness.